Welcome back to the channel. Very much thank you to the sponsors. Yet again, I would like to point out that these videos are mostly for you because it's thanks to you that they can get done. I really appreciate the support. It does mean a very great deal to me. So thank you so much indeed. Today we will finally do something a little bit different than usual, and for once in my life, I'm not going to be discussing ship models. I'm not going to be criticizing kits, manufacturers, or specific products. Yay for that, I say. We'll talk about something that was a significant part of my research for a while, that in a moment of unpardonable optimism, I thought will bring great additional knowledge. It didn't quite pan out the way it was expected. However, I think that it is one of the lesser known and yet most interesting conflicts to be fought in the later 17th century in the West Indies. So, without further ado, let us delve into the background of what would become the naval battle of Tobago. Tobago is one of these interesting pieces of land, fairly small island in the southern Caribbean. It is south of the hurricane line, so usually it is a safe base for sailors. And it has the rather questionable notoriety of having been changed hands something in the vicinity of 25 to 28 times ever since Europeans sailed into the Caribbean waters. I have seen both figures, so I don't know which one is the actually accurate one. I have not sat down to count them on my fingers, but that's what my sources are claiming. Why, of course, the first question is why was Tobago of such a great interest to European powers? It was not for what the island really was producing in this part, because it was not really until the 18th century that the island truly became a productive part of the colonial sugar economy. But in the early stages, as you can see in the slides, what was important was the strategic location of the island. Because whenever you're sending a fleet into the Caribbean, by the time it had crossed the Atlantic, it was in desperate need of cleaning, rewatering, wooding, etc., before the fleet could really be deployed into action. And the first half of the 17th century, as far as naval warfare is concerned, is really mostly the story of the continuing 80-year war of the United Seven Provinces against Spain and Portugal, which until the 1640s were united under the same crown from about 1580 until the 1640s. So Tobago is in a perfect location if you are planning to attack the Spanish possessions in the New World. You can reach the island without being noticed from the mainland. In fact, without being noticed from any other island. The only other such position is, of course, Barbados. That also is out of the way, and you can reach it without anyone being any the wiser. By reaching Tobago, you have time to refit the fleets, you can provision, the crews can rest and recuperate from the lengthy crossing, and you can attack the enemy before they have even realized that you had arrived. This, anyway, was the theory behind it. Whether it ever really worked out to this extent, it's questionable. What is undoubtedly true, however, is that the island did change hands and that numerous European powers, and some quite unexpected ones among them, claimed possession of the island. Of course, the English were among those who did. claim possession. In fact, that possession was expressed in the kind, generous deed of King James I and VI of Scotland, who gave the island to one of his courtiers. He had absolutely no right, since he did not possess the island at any stage, but that did not stop him from generously giving it on. Among the unlikely colonial powers who claimed possession of the island for a bit was actually the Duchy of Courland. And the early parts of the period, the two of the bays on the island to the present day are named after Courland, Great Courland Bay and Small Courland Bay, and they are on the northwestern side, really the northern side of the island. Their control did not last very long. It was never undisputed. On the other side of the island there were also Dutch presence. In fact, the Courland colony was surrounded by the Dutch on both sides. All was going well for the Courlanders until the Duke became a rather unwilling guest of King Karl X Gustav of Sweden. He tended to oppose it, and opposing the Swedes in this period was an occupational hazard that likely was going to end with a heavy defeat. So for the next 10 years, the Duke was, as I said, the unwilling guest of the Swedish crown, as a result of which there was no interest in supporting the colony, or no abilities either to support the colony. For those who are unaware, the Duchy of Courland is, roughly speaking, modern-day Latvia. In the process, while the Duke was unable to look after his pet project of colonizing in the Caribbean, the Courlanders ran out of provisions, out of supplies. They could see no aid coming from anywhere, until the quote-unquote, from contemporary documents, the Hollanders offered them a rather good deal. It was what the Godfather would describe as an offer that you cannot refuse. And namely, the offer was either you recognize the supremacy of the States General of the Netherlands, and then we supply you, feed you, help you, or you resist and then we simply conquer the colony. Very smart choice, very easy to make. Off and on, this conflict continued until the 60s. During the Second Anglo-Dutch War, a group of privateers captured the island and destroyed the Dutch presence there, and subsequently went privateering against the Spaniards rather than the Dutch. An English squadron, this time with crown ships, including the St. David. There is, in fact, Willem van de Velde drawing of this action, attacked and captured the island also, but did not occupy it, at least not for long. So by this stage we are reaching the 1670s, the Third Anglo-Dutch War. The English withdrew from the war, and the Dutch and the French continue fighting it out until eventually, with the persuasive power of the English Navy, both the French and the Dutch agreed to a truce and peace treaty that did not last for very long, but that lay into the future. This is a map of Tobago showing the island about the time of the battle. In fact, this is the period when the map was produced. It is in the Dutch archives, and a big thank you goes to my colleagues who actually shared it with me. 1676, the French and the Dutch are exchanging raids on each other's colonies. The Dutch returned to the Caribbean in some strength during the European off-season for fighting, specifically with the purpose of re-establishing Dutch dominance in the Caribbean, and also to recover some of the colonies lost to the French. The first part of the expedition included the capture of French Cayenne. It went very successfully. From there onwards, the Dutch fleet was moving north through the islands, attacking all the way to Martinique and Saint-Marie. Ultimately, however, the Dutch fleet had two tasks besides destroying French colonies and privateering. The return trip, they were supposed to help re-establish the Dutch presence in Tobago and re-establish a colony. It has never been explained why and how, but part of the fleet, some of the larger vessels, split from the main squadron and abandoned the Dutch commander, Jakob Binckes. Jakob Binckes is a name that should be well known to most Americans, for the simple reason that he is the man who captured New York in the early stages of the Third Anglo-Dutch War and returned it to Dutch control, together with the Devil, otherwise known as one of the great Dutch commanders. Jakob Binckes, who was representative of the Amsterdam Admiralty, however, was not in any form or fashion negatively impacted by the New York expedition, unlike his colleagues, who seems to have lost some of the confidence of its province. So on this slide, on the left, I represent the two main participants in the battle, the two commanders-in-chief. The portrait of Jakob Binckes is actually hanging in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, to the best of my knowledge, together with the lady that was supposed to become Lady Binckes, but for obvious reasons did not quite reach that status. Returning to the battle, Binckes was highly capable, highly experienced naval commander. Recently, there has been a beautiful biography published in Dutch, which unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, is not translated yet into English. I fervently hope that eventually it will be. Binckes may be of the lesser-known commanders, but this does not make him any less capable. On the way back with his squadron, he stopped in Tobago to aid the establishment of the colony, but very quickly he realized that the man who was supposed to lead the colony is utterly incapable of organizing anything whatsoever, and certainly not of preparing a colony. So if this part of the task was to be fulfilled, then he and the squadron have to stay there and do it themselves. That was not what the initial plan had been. He stopped and he immediately began the construction of a fortification, which was to be in the center of what nowadays is Scarborough Harbor, the main city, the capital really of Tobago, which is part of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Meanwhile, news of the Dutch depredations in the Caribbean had reached France, and King Louis XIV was very eager to recover the position in the Caribbean. The problem was that he also happened to be quite short of money after the lengthy war that he had embarked upon. Enters the picture Monsieur le Comte d'Estrées, an experienced, or fairly experienced naval officer. His qualities I will address in just a moment, but one of his main qualities for the purpose was the fact that he was able and willing to loan the money to his cousin to organize the squadron. So by default, he took command of it. He did recapture French Guiana, and he was tasked with destroying all Dutch presence in the Caribbean, and mainly the capture of Curaçao, which after all was the headquarters of the Dutch West Indies Company. Instead of that, D'Estrées went chasing Binckes in Tobago. In mid-February, the French squadron arrived in Tobago, and a 2-week campaign ensued. D'Estrées was unwilling to attack Binckes in his fairly strong position. He landed large forces of infantry which significantly outnumbered the Dutch. Depending which source you're looking at, the difference is something in the vicinity. The entire Dutch force was less than 800 men. Just the land soldiers, the French squadron, were about 1,500. The French squadron was larger, both in numbers, but especially in firepower. Most of the French ships were significantly larger than the largest Dutch ships in the squadron. The land battles, however, did not yield decisive advantage to either of the two sides. So by the end of February and the beginning of March, D'Estrées had pretty much run out of options. He either had to completely abandon the campaign or had to come up with something dramatic that will bring about victory. By the beginning of March, it was quite clear that there is only one option left. An all-out attack on the Dutch force and hoping that they will somehow crumble and under the overwhelming French superiority in numbers. Another lesser commander might have crumbled, but not Binckes. The great man recognized that strategically, both sides are fighting for possession of the island. As long as you possess the island, it doesn't matter what happens to your ships. So he concentrated his force into the fort. He was fairly confident that the main French attack is going to come over land, because as he wrote in a dispatch left shortly before the battle, only a crass fool would attack me from the sea. Why did he have such a strong belief that only a fool would attack him from the sea? Well, you see, for one thing, because the shore is a lee shore. So any fleet that enters into the bay has very limited ability to beat out of that. It is a narrow, fairly narrow bay. The bay itself is not narrow, but the navigable part of it is. Not for nothing, it was known back there as either Red Rock or Rockley Bay. And sometimes Rockley Bay survives as a toponym to the present day. It is chock full of reefs and has very narrow space that is accessible with ships. Indeed, it is only a crass fool who would attack downwind into prepared position, into prepared fleet, in a very narrow area where you can't actually beat out of the bay should things go bad for you. The following morning on March 3rd, 1677, Commander Binckes, or rather Commandeur Binckes, faced just such a crass fool. It is interesting to make another comment about Monsieur D'Estrées. He had begun his life as a cavalry officer and had switched to the Navy under the very strong suggestion of the great Colbert. He had attempted to rebuild the French Navy from Richelieu's time to bring it to a world-class power, and had done significant amount of persuasion to push aristocratic officers to switch towards the Navy from what for the French was considered to be the senior service, namely the land forces. In the case of D'Estrées, this had been successful. By the Third Anglo-Dutch War, when the English and the French were allied against the Dutch, Monsieur D'Estrées was the commander of the French squadron and participated in all the battles of the Third Anglo-Dutch War. So far, so good. Therefore, he had experience of some kind at sea. It is interesting what the great Prince Rupert thought of Monsieur D'Estrées. In a letter to his cousin, King Charles II, he described D'Estrées as either a fool, a coward, or a traitor, but one of these he must be. says Rupert. Rupert was never a man to be either tactful or to mince his words, so this should be taken with a grain of salt. The reason he had such a harsh vision of Monsieur d'Estrées is that through all the battles of the two wars, d'Estrées always managed to misunderstand the signals and to be in exactly the opposite direction of where the heaviest fighting was. The personal courage of d'Estrées cannot be questioned. He was, after all, a French aristocrat. His maritime judgment and his abilities as an admiral probably can be judged. But in the case of the battles of the Third Anglo-Dutch War, much of this was probably on the orders of the king to protect the French Navy and to allow the Dutch and the English to tear each other to pieces. So for all practical purposes, Rupert never had the nominal superiority of numbers. So it is hardly surprising that de Ruyter managed to save his fleet from destruction. Returning to the Battle of Tobago and the morning of March 3rd, 1677. That is when the real battle began. Thank you so much for listening to this early part of the lecture. We shall continue next time.